Good afternoon. My name is David Luberoff, the Joint Center's Director of Fellowships and Events, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk, which will focus on the important and often overlooked interplay between fire codes, housing policies, and housing design. Before we get to that talk, let me let you know about some other upcoming talks. 2 weeks from today, on Friday, October 24th at 2 p.m., Amy Tomaso, the new Director of Policy Innovation at Ivory Innovations, will be discussing research she did as a center graduate student RA and has subsequently published as center working papers on how Massachusetts and some other states might address the problem of housing affordability by adopting policies and practices that would encourage the development of so-called missing middle housing. 2 weeks after that, on Friday, November 7th at 12:15 p.m., Stephanie Kesselman, the incoming housing director at Arnold Ventures, will be discussing research she did as a Joint Center Meyer doctoral fellow on whether and how Los Angeles's transit-oriented communities incentive program affected the quantity, type, and timing of new housing built since that law was adopted in 2017. But of course, implications not only for Los Angeles, but for many other places looking to increase the supply of affordable housing. More information about these and other events is available on our website. Now on to today's event. Our main speaker will be Seva Rodnyansky, Research Manager for the Pew Charitable Trust's Housing Policy Initiative. Seva will primarily be speaking about a new report released on Tuesday examining fire safety in multifamily buildings built after 2000, as well as an earlier report focused on fire safety in single-stair buildings. Seva will talk for about 40 to 45 minutes. Following his remarks, we'll have about 5 to 10 minutes of comments from Tim Love, a lecturer at Harvard's Graduate School of Design and founder and principal at Util Design, who's been a leading voice in efforts to ensure that building codes provide needed safety, but that also allow for the creation of well-designed and reasonably affordable housing units. After Tim is finished, we'll have conversation and Q&A that will draw on some of the remarks that, the questions, excuse me, that all of you will be putting into the Q&A. Apologies in advance if we don't get to all of your questions. A video, and we'll end by 1:10 p.m., a little bit longer than we usually go, just given that we have two speakers and want to make sure we give enough airtime to speakers and also get to at least some of your questions. A video and copies of Seva and Tim's slides will be posted on our website by early next week. Seva, welcome. It's all yours.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'm really honored to be here talking about this very important set of topics at Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies. As David said, my name is Seva Rodnyansky, and I'm the research manager at Pew Charitable Trust Housing Policy Initiative. The Housing Policy Initiative does research on housing policies and housing finance and how to make it more affordable and accessible for all Americans, as on housing availability, how to make a broader set of housing options available to Americans throughout the country. But today we'll be talking about one aspect of this, specifically fire safety and how that interacts with housing. I'll be talking about two reports that the Pew team has put out this year. The first focuses on apartment buildings and single-family homes and fire protection, and tries to answer the question about which type of housing has the lowest fire death rates. Just a preview, we find that modern apartment buildings built since 2000 have the lowest rates of fire death rates compared to single-family homes or older apartment buildings. After talking about overall buildings and their fire safety, we'll zoom in on safety and other considerations regarding single stairway apartment buildings, specifically mid-rise single stairway. But now on to the context. Why am I even here today, and why are we even talking about this? As many of you on the line may know, housing costs in the US are near all-time highs. For the typical renter, over half are spending more than 30% of their income on rent. And even more staggeringly, one quarter of renters, US renters, spend more than half of their income on rent, which is a really high share of wallet. Uh, Rents themselves at medians have reached $1,400 or more, and median sale prices in the US have topped $420,000. These are record highs for this country. On top of that, the rate of homelessness is an all-time high, and the number of homeless is an all-time high. One other important driver as we talk about all types of housing is that household sizes are actually at an all-time low at about 2.5 people per households. And 63% or almost two-thirds of the US is comprised of one or two person households. And that makes us think about the type of products, the housing types themselves that are important in making housing more affordable and providing more of it. Taken together, uh, the high cost of housing and are caused by its lack, right? When something is more expensive, or when there's not enough of something, it becomes more expensive. And various reports have estimated the housing shortage in the U.S. and kind of we peg it at about 4 to 7 million homes based on various estimates. Now, that's a lot of homes that we don't have. Closing this housing shortage of 4 to 7 million across the country is going to take multiple approaches and products. Pew and other places have pointed out that there's many different types of housing that's necessary to close these gaps. Apartment buildings of all sizes, large, medium, and small, condos, townhomes and row homes, accessory dwelling units, and attic units, manufactured homes, adaptively reusing older buildings, co-living. There's many different types, but today we'll focus on apartment buildings. And you might say, hey, well, if apartment buildings and building new ones are such a great idea, why aren't we doing it? There's multiple reasons, including regulatory ones that have been pointed out. Some of you may have heard about restrictive zoning, such as not allowing apartments at all, or not allowing apartments on land near transit or commerce, where they're most needed and where the public certainly supports having more apartment buildings. On top of that, uncertain and cumbersome permitting and other processes, such as multiple year processes to get apartment buildings improved in the first place. Other aspects that haven't seen as much attention are restrictive building codes, for example, building code elements that may add cost but not as much to safety, as well as fire safety concerns, which sometimes block new apartments, but often not other new homes. And fire safety concerns like this often affect newer homes, but not older existing homes. So we decided to investigate, is there something there to these fire safety concerns? And specifically, we looked at the question of how safe are multifamily buildings and how safe are they compared to single family buildings and newer ones versus older ones, and specifically looking at fire safety. There has been some prior research about fire deadliness. So how many fire deaths are there among fires? And that's by the National Fire Protection Association. They had a recent report that suggested or that said that fires in apartment buildings have gotten less deadly in 1980. But there's actually, compared other than that, there's been limited prior work on fire death rates by the building type and splitting it out by building age. Now, as I'll talk a little bit more later on in the presentation, there's also been a lack of analysis on buildings with specific implements. For example, by how many stairways a building has. And so we also conducted a fire safety report looking at single stairway buildings in the US context. And on top of this, This webinar series covers a very broad range of topics related to housing and housing policies, and in many of them, there's ample data on various forms of housing. In this arena about fire safety, building codes, fire deaths, there's actually quite a few data limitations, and so that's another reason why we decided to delve into this. Speaking about the data, I know there's some data nerds here on in the audience. Understanding fire death rates for us required combining multiple data sets. There's two publicly available fire death and fire incident data sets. They are both by different parts of the U.S. Fire Administration. The first one is called the National Fire Incident Reporting System, NFIRS, and this is a uh, this is a data set where fire departments voluntarily report information, including what happened in a fire incident, and if there was a fire, if there was an injury or a fire death, what happened in that. This has pretty good take up, but not all fire departments report, and as a result, it doesn't give full coverage to the set of fire deaths in a given year. On top of that, the U.S. Fire Administration puts out another report called Home Fire Fatalities in the News, where teams at the USFA scrub local and national news articles for additional information about deaths. So together, we put those two data sets together, deduplicated any duplications, and then added any necessary information from archived news articles and clips about the fire deaths specifically. We also looked at building ages and types for the buildings in which residential fires occurred that had deaths, and we got these information from property records, assessor data from Adam Inc. and other places, as well as online searches of real estate websites and news articles. So this was not a well put together data set beforehand, and it required a lot of systematic and manual work. To understand how many buildings there are total, not just the ones that had fire incidents, we used American Community Survey data on building type and age by units and structure. And then for the single stair project, we also looked at New York City's land use data set, which is called the primary land use tax lot output data. Happy to answer more questions I'll find about the data. So methodologically, what did we do? This is not going to be a lot of econometrics. In fact, there's none, right? It was a pretty simple approach. We merged the two data sets together. We created a comprehensive data set of U.S. fire deaths for 2023, which is the most recent year that had complete data from both. We checked to make sure that 2023 was a reasonably representative year among fire deaths, and it was. We also coded every fire death by housing type, whether it was in a single family or apartment building, and the number of units, and the year of construction. We calculated a fire death rate measure per million residents in that type of housing based on these fire deaths and the total population living in each housing types. And then we broke this out by state to make sure that that we understood the state-specific trends, not just the national trend. And then we added in additional years for small population states. We made sure that we had at least 50 deaths per state to ensure that we had, some sort of sample to understand this pattern, both at the state level and nationally. And our headline finding is that when we look by building age and by building type, new apartments have 1/6 the fire death rates of other housing. So as you look at this chart, newer apartment buildings built in 2000 or later had 1.2 million fire deaths, or 1.2 fire deaths per million residents, whereas older multifamily buildings or single family buildings had 7.7 and 7.6 fire deaths per million residents. And these differences are, statistically significant and, and are of meaningful magnitudes. Here's a little bit more specifics about the sample of fire incidents and fire deaths overall. So from about 2,000 fire incidents that were deadly in 2023 that occurred in residential in residential buildings, there was about 2,400 fire deaths. The bulk of the fire deaths were in single family homes, but also the bulk of Americans live in single family homes as well. But what really stood out to us, if you look at the right-hand column that says modern multifamily, so modern apartments built since 2000, we saw that there were only 20 deadly fire incidents in 2023 that resulted in 23 fire deaths. So the share of fatal fire deaths for that year in this building type was only 1%, even though 6% of Americans live in this type of housing. So that was a very safe rate relative to the number of Americans that live in that type of housing. So we said, well, what's going on with single family? Can we get a little bit more info on this? So this is a chart similar to what I showed to above, but this breaks out multifamily and single family both after 2000 and before, built after 2000 and before 2000. And we noticed that actually both single family and multifamily buildings have gotten safer in terms of fire deaths uh, over time. The fire death rates in single family before 2000 were 8.6 fire deaths per million, and built after 2000 was 4.9. So again, a meaningful and statistically significant decrease. But in multifamilies, decrease was even greater, from 7.7 fire deaths per million for buildings built before 1999 or earlier, to 1.2 for those built in 2000 or later. When we disaggregated further by decade, because we wanted to see when did these decreases really start, we were able to show a chart, a line chart like this. So this shows by decade on the x-axis what was the annual fire death rate per million residents, and we see that both the blue multifamily line and the green single family building line, or sorry, and the orange single family building line have decreased over time. However, one particular trend that we see is that the apartment line, the blue one, the fire death rate per million has decreased it's so in a such steeper way, such that the newest of the new buildings, 2010 or newer, there is a 0.5 fire deaths per million residents, which is incredibly low. And so, kind of again, providing additional information that newer buildings overall are safer, but newer apartments are really safe in terms of fire safety. We also looked at apartment building size. So we separated 2 to 4 units, often known as plexes, from 5+ units, because we thought, well, maybe there's a size consideration, that maybe it's the smaller buildings or the bigger buildings that are safer. But overall, we found that the trend is similar, that regardless of unit size, whether it was plexes or slightly or larger buildings, they are safer than old ones and had very low annual fire death rates per million. Moreover, the way that in most American jurisdictions, whether it's states or localities, the building code that governs apartment buildings usually starts at 3 units. So in this case, that would include some of the blue bars here and all of the orange bars. But 2-unit buildings or duplexes are governed by the International Residential Code, which covers single family and 2-unit. And so we thought maybe there were differences there. But again, it looks from the data that we have, it doesn't look like there's any real difference by building size for multi-unit buildings. Now, I just threw a lot of data and descriptive statistics at you that show that over time, buildings have gotten safer in terms of fire safety in the US, and apartment buildings even more. So you might be asking yourself, well, that's great, but what happened, right? How did that actually happen? Well, there's multiple things that we think are going on. So first of all, modern apartment buildings are equipped with multiple layers of fire safety measures. This is partially a result of the proliferation of more standardized building codes in the 2000s and onwards, but also which made many of the things that you see on the screen that I'll talk about in a second common in new apartment buildings. These include sprinklers, self-closing doors, smoke detectors, that are on and that work. Fire-rated walls, so walls that can withstand fires for an hour or 2 hours, as well as non-combustible stairways, so materials that are won't light on fire and will withstand fire to make sure that people can get out in the stairs. These and other innovations in both regulations and materials and technology have made modern apartment buildings much, much safer. So I said we look nationally, but let's see how this plays out across the states to make sure that there isn't some really big variation, regionally or in particular area. So we looked at every state with at least 50 fire deaths in 2023, and they're displayed for you in this very, very noisy table here. And we did the same analysis, looking at fire death rates per million for single family, for older multifamily, and for new apartments. So if you look at the new apartments row, which is one from the right, you will see that in every state but one, the modern apartments, the newest ones built since 2000, have lower or much lower fire death rates than in older buildings or in single family. So that to us suggests that this is not just a big, there's not just one data point that's weighing it all down, but rather this is happening in pretty much every state. We also looked at states with perhaps fewer than 50 deaths per year, and we looked further back. Perhaps 2023 was not so indicative for each state. And so for the states displayed here, from Arizona to Colorado, all the way to Wisconsin and Wyoming, we looked at enough years of data such that there was at least 50 deaths, and often this covered 2 or 3 years of data for each state, or sometimes as far back as a decade. And again, in nearly every one of these cases, the annual fire death rates for new apartment buildings were just much, much lower than older apartment buildings or than single family buildings as a whole. So again, it's the same pattern, regardless of whether we look at big states or small states, 1 year of data or multiple years of data. New apartments are simply they're much safer in terms of fire safety and fire deaths. Okay, so if that provides kind of the data, what are the implications? So I think the implications from this is that when you remove regulatory buildings to building more apartments, this in fact improves fire safety, because the more new apartment buildings you can get in a place and you can have as part of your housing supply, the lower the fire death rate. Now, one of the other contextual pieces that's going on is that the US housing stock is in fact the oldest it's ever been. And that's true for the housing stock as a whole, which is over 31 years old on average. And for the apartment buildings, which is that, and for rental units, which is that blue line, they're even older. So the fact is, older housing usually lacks modern fire safety measures, whether that's single family or multifamily. And so building more apartment buildings in any way that's possible, and frankly, building new housing, new single family as well, will greatly improve fire safety outcomes. And again, just to highlight how building age really strongly correlates with fire death rates, wanted to share this table. So we have, by every row has the construction year, and this is only for multifamily apartment buildings, and it shows the number of fires and deaths in 2023. And the relative amount of people who live in apartment buildings built within each of these decades, right? So the multifamily fire death rate for the newest buildings is just staggeringly low, 0.5 for those built since 2000, and 1.8 for those built from 2000 to 2009. And again, the newer it is, the lower the fire death rate. Okay, well, you might say, well, this was really nice, and wow, new apartments do seem to have lower fire death rates, but how do we get more new apartments? You said there's all these caveats and there's all these potentially regulatory issues that stand in the way. So we're going to look at one particular aspect that we looked at Pew with together with the Center for Building in North America. And those are single stairway mid-rise buildings. And I know the Joint Center did a presentation on single stair buildings. So some of this might be old news to some of you, but hopefully for others, there's more to see. So before we even get to single stair, just wanted to highlight that states and localities have, in the recent few years, been enacting laws and passing measures to allow more housing types of all, right? And this is just a list of examples of what's happened in the past few years, but states have, gone through and enabled accessory dwelling units. They have legalized multifamily near commerce or transit, such as in Texas this year and Colorado last year. Some have streamlined permit approval processes, such as in Arizona this year, and others have limited parking mandates, such as Washington and Montana, and have done a variety of other things. But some have also done building code reforms specifically on the single stair issue, including Tennessee last year and New Hampshire this year. So again, this is not the only policy that's going to it's going to help increase the production of apartment buildings. It's part of a suite of policies, but this is one that we're focusing on today. Not sure why that's not showing up, but just wanted to preview is that the US has a shortage of small apartment buildings, which tend to be more affordable than other rental unit types. And if these graphs actually showed up, what you'd see is that about 20% of US renters live in smaller apartment buildings, but they haven't been produced at the same rate as larger apartment buildings. And in fact, most of the new apartments that have been produced are much larger than smaller and mid-rise apartment buildings. Now, why is this important? Why is this perhaps happening? We think that this is happening because construction costs in the US are actually higher for multifamily units, including low-rise multifamily up to 3 stories and mid-rise multifamily up to 7, 8 stories than it is in single family. So one of the reasons that we're not getting as many smaller and medium multifamily, which again, some people might call the missing middle of housing, or at least the missing middle of rental housing, is because it is more expensive to build. And that's not the case in other countries, including Germany or Italy or Mexico, who do have mid-rise single stair. Now, how does the cost have to do with single stairways? Well, stairways are one such cost item, and they're not actually a cheap item as well. So we compared a small 6-story apartment buildings that has 4 units per story, so 24 units total, and 2,000 square feet per floor. So again, a kind of a narrow cube type building with 4 units per floor and 6 stories. And we compared a building like this with 1 staircase versus 2 staircase, and using kind of base construction costs and area, we estimated that the cost for such a building with 2 staircases is about $3 million, and a cost with 1 staircase would range from 2.6 to 2.8 million. So again, you would get a cost savings of, anywhere from 180 to 390,000, and all in, this is about 6 to 13% lower on your construction costs, including accounting for any additional fire protection that you would put into that single staircase. And so this 6 to 13% may not seem like a lot, but if you talk to builders and real estate professionals, this is actually a very meaningful number. So again, if we're thinking about how to get more more smaller and mid-rise multifamily buildings at lower cost, potentially reducing 1 staircase can enable viability. Not only that, but having 1 staircase actually could increase the amount of rentable area in your building, which means that you could charge more rent and that tenants would have more space, or you could use less area. So this image this image is a rendering of one floor in a proposed five-story building in Jersey City, New Jersey. This five-story building has 2 units each on each floor, so a 10-unit building. In yellow is the corridor, or sorry, in yellow is the second staircase, and in green is the corridor to connect the second staircase. So again, together, those take up about 9% of the space on this floor. So either you can add most of that space back to the units, perhaps that's an extra bedroom or a bigger kitchen, or you could take it out altogether and perhaps be able to build this building on a smaller or irregularly shaped lot. So again, having one staircase may help smaller apartment buildings pencil out financially. Now, I've been talking a lot about these single stair, and you might be like, well, what is it? How does this look like? What is he really talking about? So here we have an example of the typical apartment building that has 2 stories on the left-hand side, also called the double-loaded corridor building. So the staircases are in orange. And they're connected by a hallway or a corridor, also in orange. And effectively, they mean that most units are only facing one side or the other. In contrast, on the right-hand side is the single-stair 6-story building. Again, same height, slightly different size. The staircase is in the middle. The units could look different. And these are renderings and examples of a single-stair building that is currently allowed in Seattle, in the state of Washington. Notably, Seattle, New York City, and Honolulu, as well as many European and Asian countries, currently do allow mid-rise single-stair buildings, versus pretty much all other U.S. jurisdictions do not, at least until perhaps the last year or two. Now, for those of us that aren't used to looking at renderings, here's what these Seattle buildings, for example, actually look like, right? So this provides kind of 3 examples, all with market rate apartments. One, the one on the right has 10 units, the one in the middle has 22 units, one on the left has 23 units, different parts of Seattle, different designs, different architectural flourishes. Some have parking, some don't. So they really can look just like any other apartment building, but they're able to fit on smaller lots. And each of these is about 4,000 to 5,000 square feet total. On top of cost advantages and land utilization advantages, single-stair buildings can have more natural light and ventilation. So on the left-hand side, it just shows that unit in blue, which can have a cross breeze, which can help with cooling, as well as air circulation to be less stuffy. And on the right-hand side, the red diagram shows that with a single-stair design, most units should have at least 2 sunlight that can come in from 2 sides, if not maybe 3 or 4, depending on the size of units. And again, the typical unit in a double loaded kind of regular apartment building only has sun coming in on one side. Moreover, because you only have that one staircase and not 2, you can arrange you can arrange apartment units in different ways. This page shows kind of a Tetris-like diagram for how you can arrange units on a particular floor. And again, depending how you arrange a Tetris, you can get more larger family size units, such as 3 bedrooms and 4 bedrooms, whereas many newer apartment buildings today have studios or 1 bedrooms. So this is a way to make apartments available for different for different needs and different sizes. And finally, additional benefits are that these types of small single-story buildings are great for fitting on small lots. They can fit well in historic downtowns and main streets, so they don't have to be in big city. They don't just have to be in big cities. They can be in smaller locations as well, and they can increase the types of housing units. It can be for rent, or it can be condo for own. And the New York Times actually recently covered odd lots, so difficult to build, strangely shaped pieces of land, and single-stair type designs for mid-rise buildings are one way to actually fit well into these odd lots. And because these odd lots are harder to fill or harder to build on otherwise, it's going to be a really good solution for them. Uh, what those were a lot of the benefits, but some of the real questions on single stairway buildings in the US at least have been, are they safe? Right? What happens during a fire? Are there fire safety considerations? And those are important questions, and we wanted to find out about them too. So again, we did this report with the Center for Building North America to try to see if we can assess fire safety in single stairway buildings in the US context. Just to put these in perspective, the wanted to show how big or small single stair buildings of the currently allowed type in Seattle and similarly in New York City are compared to what's currently allowed for a regular two staircase or double loaded corridor building. So on the bottom, that little tiny thing here kind of is the single stair building. It's the size of about 1/3, maybe at most, of a typical American football field, whereas a kind of regular apartment at its max allowable floor plate, which is basically as big as you can build it, and some are can be up to 620 feet long, so almost double the size of a standard American football field. And on top of that, single stair buildings have less people per stairway, which make evacuation faster. Whereas on the top building here, right, someone might be going from this middle apartment to an exit. They could be walking 250 feet or more, which is a lot in a fire. Whereas in a single stairway building, the way they're currently done right now, is basically 20 feet from your door. So you're pretty much right next to the exit, making it much easier to get out. As I said before, single stair buildings are built to modern building codes. That means they use the most modern safety technology. They have short distances from the unit to the exit. They have pressurized stairs or protected stairways, and they have fewer units that can be impacted by a particular fire event. There's been little research on these, but in the Netherlands, there has been a substantial report that looked at fatal fires and rescues by building type. In the Netherlands, they have a type of apartment building called a portic flat, where units typically share a communal staircase, and they're 4 to 5 stories tall. So this is similar to the 4 to 6 story mid-rise apartment buildings we're talking about today. Each unit has a porch or a balcony from which people can await rescue. What we found based on their research is that these portic flats are single stair porch apartments. It's the second set of columns from the left on this chart, have much lower fatal fire rates. And again, this isn't our research. This is by the Netherlands Institute for Public Buildings. And so they have lower fatal fire rates than apartment buildings with long corridors. So in kind of the Netherlands context, this suggests that single stair buildings are in fact even safer than larger apartment buildings with multiple staircases and indoor corridors. Nevertheless, we wanted to see if we can find a US example and US numbers for building safety for single stair buildings. So we looked at New York City and Seattle, which are the only 2 US cities with a large number of modern single stair buildings, each of which have had this type of building allowed for almost the past 50 years. So we looked in New York City specifically to see how many modern single stair buildings there are and to look at the number of fire deaths in each and compare them to all other residential buildings. So we went through the land use database in New York and found 4,440 modern single stair buildings. And looking at fire data from 2012 to 2024, we found that they had 3 fire deaths in those types of mid-rise modern single stair buildings. We looked specifically at the fire deaths and pulled fire marshal reports for them, and which concluded that they were not, the fires occurred in the unit. They were not related to the exit or the egress outside of the unit, and the fires did not spread beyond the unit of origin, meaning that even for those 3 fire deaths, if there were 2 staircases or more, it really wouldn't have mattered in those cases. We also calculated what the fire death rate is. And again, we use this measure of fire death rate per occupant years of experience. So this is how many years did that building or that type of building exist. And we found that for both single stair 4 to 6 story buildings and for all other residential, the fire death rate was 5 per million occupant years in each case. And again, were not statistically significantly different from each other. So for us, this provides a um, understanding that single stair buildings in New York and 4 to 6 story ones are as safe in terms of fire deaths as all other residential buildings in New York. We also looked at Seattle, which has had mid-rise multifamily in the single stair context allowed for since the 1970s. And here we found that from 2012 to 2024, there was one fire death in these types of buildings. Again, this fire death occurred in the unit and was not related to egress outside of the unit, and the fire didn't spread beyond the unit of origin. In Seattle, we were not able to locate a denominator, right? So how many single stair buildings are there total, just based on the way that their land use and parcel databases are. However, it's estimated by others to have at least several hundred single stair buildings. So again, this type of construction appears to be extremely safe from a fire death rate perspective, at least in the two cases in the US where there's many of them. And if we look at other countries that allow single stair at higher stories, in the US they're allowed up to 3 stories, elsewhere they're allowed much higher. If they were really a problem in causing higher fire death rates, we would find that the fire death frequency or the fire lethality, right? So how many people are dying per population or how many people are dying per number of fires would be higher if these were really deadly. But in fact, we find that fire death rates in the countries that allow single stair mid-rise multifamily are actually lower than the US. We also looked at the things that would make single stair construction safe. These would include mid-rise heights, not tall towers, but mid-rise heights, limited floor sizes, either by unit count or by area, or how far you go from the door to the exit, protecting stairways, such as through self-closing doors or smoke control, modern fire-safe materials and systems, sprinklers, smoke detectors, and walls and doors designed to limit fire spread. As well as this could work in any type of construction, whether in New York, where most of it is made of non-wood, or in Seattle, where most of it is made of wood. And just to say that some of these, the single stair idea, while newer and perhaps more niche, has certainly garnered recent attention. And I think the discussant, Tim Love, is going to talk a little bit about the experience in Boston. But just to preview, their analysis finds that there's plenty of vacant and underused lots that are perfect for things like 4 to 6 story single stair buildings. And if all of those lots were filled up with these, it could net up to 130,000 new units, which would close Boston's housing area shortage by about 2/3. Moreover, on a policy side, over 14 states have passed laws to either authorize, enable, or study single-stair buildings in the past couple of years, including 6 this year alone. And finally, Austin, Texas recently authorized single-stairway building construction, and in fact, it has permitted its first mid-rise single-stair buildings earlier this year. I know I talked for a while. This is the last page, so I want to recap and give opportunity to David and Tim. So what did we learn today? We found that new apartment buildings have very low fire death rates, 6 times lower than older ones. We've also found that new single-family buildings are also safer than older single-family buildings, but again, not as safe as new apartment buildings. Building more apartment buildings would provide a large boost in fire safety, again, throughout. We also talked about modern single-family apartments, which are built to code and with safety in mind. And based on New York City's experience, they have the same rate of fire deaths as in other residential buildings. And finally, mid-rise single-stair buildings can really help close the housing shortage and improve fire safety overall. I want to thank you for the time and passing it back to David.
Seva, thank you. This is just a thrilling presentation. As I indicated before, Tim Love has been a leading voice in efforts to think about how building codes affect design and quality and affordability. Tim, I'm uh, curious. Is there anything that particularly struck you in this presentation that you either want to highlight or discuss further, or maybe take issue with?
No, I think it was a concise, thorough presentation, and a lot of the data points that Sieva brought up are new. I think, in the discussions I've had, mostly with fire safety professionals, there's the question of the necessity for the single stair for fire professionals to, if people are exiting down one stair, to use another one. And I think the issues of length, allowable length of current double stairs is uh, I think proof that while that might be an issue, it probably isn't an issue with the 6 stories that is being recommended in a lot of the reform. I'd like to focus instead on what's at stake in terms of housing production, because that was the framing that I think brought us all together. So if I could share a few slides, David, if that's okay, I wanted to make a 3-minute point.
Of course,
So let me know what you can see. Are you just seeing the slideshow or lots of other things on top of it?
slideshow.
Okay. I wanted to come back to the diagram of what's allowed with the maximum length of a building that's allowed with just 2 egress stairs, and maybe frame it from a real estate development return on investment standpoint. And the way that you can think about it is that the real estate market and developers are incentivized to harvest as much rentable space uh, from 2 stairs as possible, because those decisions that are made about projects penciling out are really a game of inches. And so the market prefers actually buildings that have this length of corridors. And the way the market deals with it is to, sorry, going this way, large sites and essentially curl these buildings around into all kinds of configurations, C shapes, E shapes, F shapes, to try to get long corridors to fit on sites. And the consequence of that is that this is what housing production looks like, which is uh, a strategy to maximize again the length of corridors based on and reduce the number of egress stairs. And so you're seeing on the left the kinds of development that's happening around the commuter rail station in Chelsea. And then recent residential development, just a kind of zoomed in snapshot of what the market is building in Alewife and Cambridge. And so this means that most of the housing production that's happening, at least in Greater Boston, are on these large post-industrial sites. But when we ran an analysis of developable sites that were within a 15-minute of transit in Greater Boston, we looked at sites that had a higher propensity for redevelopment because they had an existing FAR of zero point 0.1 and lower. And we removed in other data points in the GIS analysis that we did, we removed open space, lots that were too skinny to build anything. The consequence of that was that um, most of the available lots uh, actually work for these small buildings that we've been talking about today. But there were very few left that would work for these big double-loaded corridor buildings, which is, you know, rough justice, 14, 15,000 square foot lots and above. So the biggest opportunity for TOD development in the greater Boston area requires single stair buildings because uh, a 2 stair building in a residential floor plate that's smaller than 9 to 11,000 square feet just doesn't work in terms of the net to gross ratio. It's very hard to get the underwriting for those So this is not just an issue about fire safety, it's about housing production. And I just wanted to bring that point home as part of the session today. Turn it back over to you, David.
Thank you. And as Seva, I was about to ask you to go on someone. I want to back up and just ask two clarifying questions on the research. The first, which showed up at least in one of the questions, is what happened in 2000? Why all of a sudden? I mean, there is a steady shift, but um, there's an important policy change I think that happens in 2000 that I just want to make sure people understand what happened. And why we're seeing this dramatic reduction.
For sure. Thanks for the clarifying question, everybody and David. So one of the reasons we're seeing this distinction is because in 2000 and in the few years onwards, the set of organizations and building codes in the US kind of coalesced to one, which is run by the ICC, the International Code Council. And so they have uh, two of their building codes, the International Residential Code, which covers 1 to 2 unit buildings, and the International Building Code, which covers 3 unit or greater buildings. So all the apartment buildings we're talking about. And these were really adopted by states and localities, especially the International Building Code, kind of throughout the early 2000s and onwards, such that by, later 2000s, it's pretty well adopted throughout the country. And so that leads to some standardization in the types of building codes that are adopted. And, these have sprinkler requirements and, more sophisticated smoke alarm requirements and others that really permeate through.
Thanks. A second, just clarifying question, and if those who've seen the paper, um, can you talk just a little bit about whether and what you found when you looked at other alternative explanations of why there were so many fewer fire deaths, and I think in particular you were responding to suggestions that perhaps people in older buildings were older, or poorer, or they lived in poorer neighborhoods. And it just struck me as an important secondary research that is worth speaking about.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up. I wish I had more time in the presentation to cover, but a lot of the reviews we've had and other people bring up, important considerations about who is living in the buildings and where the buildings are located. And generally speaking, uh, lower income people and older people in the US have have higher death rates from fire. That's just kind of stated facts from the statistics. And so ideally, the fire databases that we've been drawing from would have information, that well-reported information on age and on where the building is and on how much you're making and lots of sociodemographics. They don't, so there's some data limitations, but there's a few things that we were able to glean from that. First, we thought, well, if it was really older persons, then we should see a higher share of older persons dying in these modern multifamily, but they're not. We're seeing kind of similar rates. Like this isn't just about the age of people who live in each of these in terms of who's dying. In terms of neighborhood income, similarly, there are new apartment buildings both in lower income places and in higher income places. And if we really saw an imbalance in that, we would expect to see differences in fire outcomes, but we do not. In terms of the income of who's living in these buildings, we don't have enough information to connect that to fire. So that's certainly a possibility. And like I said, this is kind of the first or second piece on this topic. And we would love to have more detailed research or more detailed data collection on this.
Great. I've got two more questions, and I think we'll probably wind up going till about 1:15 if folks are still keeping track of time. There are several questions about elevators, and both whether the U.S. code is overly stringent, and whether there also need to be are or should be required in single stair buildings. And I'm sure both of you have some thoughts about uh, code requirements for elevators. So, Tim, why don't I start with you, and then I'll switch back to Sieva.
Yeah, I think it's linked to life safety issues again. You know, large elevators are um, required because they can accommodate, you know, a stretcher or are part of the evacuation of people, not just in fires, but have other kind of life-threatening conditions. And so the scale of the elevator as a percentage of the overall floor area is an issue, but also their cost versus the smaller scale elevators you see in Europe and other parts of the world. It is possible to build a building without an elevator in Massachusetts if you provide accessible units on the ground floor. So walk-up buildings are possible, but not above the third floor. So if any single stair code reform that would allow 4 to 6 stories, the requirement for an elevator would kick in. But I think it's tied to the same life safety issues that are driving the discussion about 2 stairs.
Yeah, and adding on what Tim said, we did not look at elevators explicitly in either of these reports, so just beyond the scope. But kind of in follow-up conversations, one thing that's been suggested is, well, if you take out the second staircase, there's your space for an elevator. And again, you kind of have the same amount of land and perhaps more accessibility, and in some cases, an additional way to get up or down.
There were also a couple of questions about what happens in a single stair building if the fire itself is in the stairwell. Um, that the second stairwell, were it there would provide a different form of egress. Again, I don't know if you've got some thoughts about how to respond to that concern.
Right.
Sieva, why don't you
I
start?
was gonna say, I'll start, Tim, and you can go ahead. So this is certainly something that we were concerned about as well, and we wanted to understand, right? And so in these modern buildings, modern single stair mid-rise buildings in New York City and in Seattle, they're sprinklered, they're cordoned off by firewalls, they're made of non-combustible materials and enclosed with fire-resistant doors. So basically, all the best modern protections you can get. And still, we looked at each of the fire fatalities that occurred in those buildings, and none of them were in the staircase, right? None of them were even close to the staircase. They were all in unit, and the number of staircases, like I said, wouldn't have mattered. So it is certainly a concern, but kind of the both how they're built and the evidence to date doesn't suggest that it is as big a concern.
I think there's also it's tied to where policy might go. We're very interested in the Tennessee, municipality opt-in strategy because that makes sense, I think, for larger cities that have uh, fire equipment with ladders that can access up to the sixth floor versus smaller municipalities that wouldn't have that equipment. So I think tying a future code reform to an opt-in strategy probably makes sense to, um, reflect the need for a second way to get to units, and that would have to be from an exterior ladder. And so those are some things that we've been discussing in our discussions about how to shape future code reform. I think it's also makes sense to decrease the distance from that single stair to the furthest distance in a unit to uh, being responsible that with a single stair, maybe those distances want to be a little bit shorter.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. Certainly not to the end of our questions. I want to give a shout out to Alex Horowitz, who one of the co-authors of the report, who has been answering many questions that people posed in the Q&A. And if you haven't had a chance to look at that before we sign off, I'd also encourage folks, if were there a little bit more time, there's a really interesting discussion, I think, in the report about the implications of this research as we think about existing housing stock, and particularly, where we're renovating both existing housing stock and in some cases conversions of what we do or don't require, because it's really clear that well thought out code has had a just huge impact on fire safety. Um, I want to just end by lauding both Seva and Tim. Tim was the first person who really sat me and some of my colleagues down and sort of walked us through some of the ways that building codes really are kind of the back, the back channel text to what determines what gets built, even within the constraints or opening of land use regulation. And Sieva, as you and I discussed earlier, this is not something that many researchers have dug into at just the incredible depth. I cannot begin to imagine what it took to assemble, clean, and then actually analyze this data. And it's hugely important. Um, we, on the one hand, want to make sure people are living in safe buildings, and on the other hand, we also want to make sure that we're providing enough housing. And I just laud both of you for really helping open up this discussion in really important ways and in ways that it seems that policymakers are starting to respond to. So, on behalf of all of the folks who attended, thank you. I encourage folks to look forward, as I noted at the beginning. We have upcoming presentations on how to encourage middle market housing, analyzing one of the more notable efforts to encourage transit-oriented development, and many other things. So, on behalf of the Joint Center, on our audience, and our friends at Pew, thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.